Well, here's a parrot story. Uh, so there was a magician who had been doing his act on a cruise ship for 15 years, and the job was pretty good, except that the ship's captain had this parrot who had seen the act hundreds of times and just perched at the edge of the stage. And while the guy was doing his thing, the parrot would say, it's in his hat. She's under the table. And it just kept on giving away his magic tricks. And finally, one day, he got so frustrated, he was just on his way to strangle this parrot when the captain walked out onto the stage, waved at the people in the audience, said, "Harry, could I see you for a moment? The ship is about to hit an iceberg, and it is going to go down. And we don't have enough lifeboats for, we only have enough lifeboats for our first-class passengers, none of whom are watching your show right now. So what I need you to do is, when things start to get really loud and shaky, just tell the people here, it's all part of the act, just stay in your seat, be calm, everything's fine." Well, an hour later, the magician was floating in the ocean, hanging onto a plank of the ship, looking out, watching the skies, hoping to see a rescue helicopter. There was a black dot against the sun. It was coming closer. It was the captain's parrot. And it perched there on the edge of his plank. And it just looked at him. And finally, the magician said, "What? What do you want from me now?" And the parrot said, "I just got to know, where did you hide the ship?" All right. So when last we met, Christianity was, first of all, it was, there was like Jesus and his 12 disciples and the women who traveled with them. And they did their thing in like Judea for a couple of years. And then after that, this other thing kind of started spreading through the empire, this Christ movement, where this rumor was going around that somebody called the Christ had died and risen from the dead, and that now that the law of life and death had been broken, all of the laws of the universe were suddenly kind of in flux, and the God of Judaism, whose law had been so exclusive about who's in and who's out, suddenly this God was having this big renegotiation of who could be allowed into Judaism. And there was a lot of curiosity and a lot of excitement, and there were a lot of people kind of going around saying like, well, now the law of the Torah is just out the window and we can do whatever we want. And that little movement gets started. But it's a very small, illegal underground movement for about 300 years. In Rome and in the Roman Empire, the law was you can practice any religion that you want. Everything is legal. As long as at some point in your worship service, everybody lifts a wine cup and says, also, the emperor is divine. And everybody takes a drink to celebrate that. And besides that, you could have like an Egyptian church, you could have a Syrian church, you could have a Greek church, you could, any kind of religion that you wanted. The one group of people who refused were the Jews, who said, no, we can't, I'm sorry, it's against our commandments. We cannot raise a wine cup and say that the emperor is divine. That's just, we would all rather die. And the empire said, oh my goodness, fine, just you. And then came this other group of people who said we're the new Judaism, we're called, the Christians, and we have inherited this from them. We also don't have to raise a wine cup and say that the emperor is divine. The empire said no. They said, no, we did that for them. We're not doing that for you. If you don't raise a wine cup to the divinity of the emperor, then your meetings are illegal with, the death penalty. If we find out that you're doing it, we're going to feed you to lions in the arena. That was how Christianity became illegal. In an empire that tolerated all kinds of religions, this one little religion actually was illegal by choice. They made this decision. And so everybody else got to practice their stuff. This one little group of people said, no, we would rather be fed to the lions, and that's just what kept happening. So for 300 years, you got this little persecuted movement, and then here we are 2,000 years later, and it is the biggest religion on the planet. 1 out of 3, 1/3 of the human population, if you ask them what their religion is, they will say that they are Christian. So how do we get there? And also, how do we get to the incredible diversity? Why are there so many Christianities? If there is indeed one God and one Jesus, how could there possibly be so many Christianities? Why are there so many denominations? Denomination, the root word of that is nom. It means name. It means like, which name brand of Christianity does someone belong to? And as we probably know, when you pull into a town, at the entrance to the town, you're likely to see 2 clusters of signs. One of them saying, yes, we have KFC, Wendy's, and Burger King here in this town. And then near it, there'll be another one that says, also, we have Episcopalian, Lutheran, Methodist, Baptist. We have all of these different kind of franchises of Christianity in this town. The idea is, if you are some salesperson from Peoria and you find yourself in Niagara Falls, if you go to the Wendy's in Niagara Falls, it'll probably be very much like the Wendy's in Peoria. You can feel right at home. And theoretically, if you go to a Lutheran church in Niagara Falls, it'll still be recognizable like the Lutheran church that you go to wherever you come from. So church franchises are, kind of like restaurant franchises. They're not quite as similar as like the Wendy's here and the Wendy's there, but at least when you go in, you should be able to recognize the basic order of service. You'll be able to recognize the basic politics, the same songs, the same flow. There are a lot of churches. There are a lot of Christianities. I haven't done this count for Niagara Falls, but in Buffalo, New York, in the city of Buffalo, New York, there are 339 churches. And that's not including like the outskirts and the suburbs. There are 339 churches of 31 different brands, or 65 different brands if we count each one of the non-denominational churches as its own specific type of Christianity. A non-denominational church is one that is not Baptist or Methodist or Roman Catholic. This is just, this will be like the lucky #1 New Salvation Church on such and such corner. And it's kind of like, like a local, like mom and pop restaurant. It is, it's particular. Interestingly enough, in the history of the United States, denominational churches have been shrinking. Non-denominational churches are growing. That's where the real growth is. So like, if you pass by, such and such Methodist church, which was built to accommodate 200 people and has 12 people on a Sunday morning. But meanwhile, the non-denominational church that used to rent like the former 7-Eleven on the corner has now moved to the arena because they need more space for more people. The city of Buffalo alone has 339 churches of all of these different kinds. Um, and every single one of them is different, but there is one thing that they all have in common, that every single church in the United States has in common. And that is this. If you go into any one and you go into any church in the world and you ask, why should I go to this church and not that church that's 2 blocks that way and not that church that's 3 blocks that way? They will all tell you some version of this. They'll say, look, in the beginning, there was Jesus and the disciples and the early church. And in the beginning, they all agreed on who and what Jesus is and what Jesus wants. And then over time, the thing fragmented and it splintered. And now there keeps getting, more and more and more diversity of Christianity. But any church that you walk into, they will eventually tell you, but in this one church, we are bringing it back. We are finally doing it the way that everyone agreed that it should be in the beginning. And you'll hear this in the Catholic Church, but then 2 blocks away, you'll hear it in the Baptist Church. And then 3 blocks from there, you'll hear it at like Joe Bob's premillennial dispensational church on the corner. Every single church will tell you this same thing. Everybody else is wrong. The thing is splintered and fragmented. But in this one place, we are finally doing it the way that they agreed that it should be in the beginning. I assume that we've all heard some version of this before, especially those of us who grew up in a church and then decided for whatever reason to leave that church, and that we were told, but once you walk out of here, you're going to be doing it wrong. We're doing it the way it was meant to be done all along, and everybody else is just fumbling in confusion. I found this chart when I wanted to explain to my college students about, the diversity of Christianity. The chart is fascinating, although really it should have thousands of little things at the bottom. The main problem with this chart is at the top of the chart. Because when we actually open up the Gospels for ourselves, we see this scene where Jesus says to his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And one disciple says, "Well, some people say that you are John the Baptizer and you have somehow come back to life. And other people say that you are the prophet Isaiah or Elijah and you have returned to us again. And some people say that you are the true descendant of David and that you are meant to be the king, the Messiah." All these different people were saying all these different things. Even the disciples themselves could not agree about who Jesus was and what he wanted. What did Jesus say to clear up all of this confusion? He said, "Don't talk to people about who I am." That was what he said. He did not answer it. He does not answer to being one of the prophets returned. He does not answer to being a descendant of David, the true, whatever, king of Israel. He refused to define himself in that way. But what the story tells us accidentally is that in the time of Jesus and disciples, there was a great deal of disagreement about who he was and what he wanted. Even the disciples themselves, like the guys who quit their day jobs and they traveled with him and they lived with him, they could not agree. And when they tried to tell him what they thought individually, what they thought that he was, he would refuse to answer. He would become really sullen and actually kind of rude about it. So there was not an agreement in the beginning about who Jesus was and what he wanted. The Bible tells us so. A lot of people were following him around saying like, "Hey man, why don't you pick up a sword and lead us in some violent rebellion?" Right up until the moment he died, a lot of people kept expecting him to pick up a sword and become a great war leader. There was clearly a great deal of confusion and disagreement about him. when we read in the letters of Paul and the book of Revelation, they don't say that all of the early churches agreed about who Jesus was and what he wanted. As a matter of fact, they keep saying over and over again, this little group is doing it this way, and they are totally wrong. And this little group will tell you that thing, and they are totally wrong. And that group over there is doing that thing, and they are totally wrong. The Bible itself tells us over and over again throughout the New Testament, there never was a time when everybody agreed about who Jesus was and what he wanted. So this whole idea that if you walk into any church on earth, they will tell you, in the beginning, everybody could agree, then the disagreements started. The Bible tells us the opposite. In the beginning, there was disagreement. In the beginning, there was diversity of thought and opinion. And there has never been a time when everybody agreed about who Jesus was and what he wanted. But this myth of, initial uniformity, that in the beginning of the thing, everybody agreed, that's the only way that you can keep Christians together in this church or in this denomination, is by saying, we are the only ones who are bringing back what everyone agreed on in the beginning. One of the biggest disagreements in early church history, Paul reports in his letter to the Galatians, Paul, who had never met Jesus, and also there is a story in a book called the Acts of the Apostles, in which Paul was traveling on the road to Damascus, and he fell from his chariot, and he was blinded, and then his sight was restored, and there was Jesus who spoke to him personally, one-on-one. That is in a book called the Acts of the Apostles. Paul, in all of his letters, never once mentions it. He never says anything like that. Paul has never heard that story before. If Paul had met Jesus in that way on the road to Damascus, he would have started every letter by saying, I am Paul. I met Jesus on the road to Damascus. That's why you should listen to me. Paul never mentions it. He's never heard of it. So that's a very dramatic story, but it's a story that Paul himself had never heard of. He did not meet Jesus in any way. He heard some stuff, but actually, if you read all of the letters of Paul, you will find that Paul has never heard of anything like a father had two sons and one of them said this and one of them said that. Paul has never heard any of the parables. He's never heard any of the teachings of Jesus. The one time that Paul quotes Jesus in all of his letters is when he said, take, eat, this is my body, etc. And that is far more likely to be the gospel authors quoting Paul. It's the only time that Paul says he heard of anything that Jesus said. But also, of all the things that Jesus says in the Gospels, that is the one that kind of least fits in with, what seems to have been his idea of what a human being is. The Torah does strictly forbid cannibalism. The Torah even forbids pretend cannibalism. It would never have occurred to Jesus to tell people to eat his flesh. But, all right, so Paul goes traveling around, and he's telling people all kinds of things. He doesn't know any stories about Jesus except that he was crucified. But he's telling people stuff. And finally, Paul tells us, after 15 years on the road telling people about Jesus throughout the Roman Empire, he finally went to Jerusalem. He finally went to meet Jesus's brothers and his surviving disciples who were still around. Interestingly, Paul tells us, after Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, the Jesus movement continued. They set up shop right there in Jerusalem. And Paul tells us that Peter, Jesus's best friend, is still there. Two of Jesus's brothers, James and Jude, are still there. And they're kind of still going around telling people things that their brother said, telling people things that their friends said. Paul meets Jesus's brothers and his best friend. And he says, hey, this is so exciting. You know, like, I've been telling people all of this stuff about your brother, Jesus, and people are really excited. Paul did not get the response that he expected. Jesus's brothers looked at him and said, what are you telling people? Like, what are you telling people about our brother? He's dead. He died. That's really sad. What is all of this stuff? They've never heard of it. Paul says, well, maybe you guys don't understand it. He goes and he has a talk with Peter. He says, look, you really were his best friend. Now that his brothers are out of the room, maybe they're just like picking on him or something. You know, I hope we can agree on something. Paul talked with Peter. They also could not agree. Paul said, isn't it great that your brother said we don't have to be kosher anymore? Peter said, oh my goodness, man, like, what have you been eating? Like, what are you smoking? What are you thinking? Like, what's up with you? All of this cosmic Christ stuff. Jesus's friends and brothers have no idea about it. They just remember that their friend was an interesting speaker and that people liked him and that he died. Paul tells us that the meeting has gone terribly. He said, finally, the one thing that they could agree on, he said they could agree that they should never meet or speak to each other again. And as Paul is leaving the room, and this is Paul himself telling us, and it's not his proudest moment, so we kind of have to believe him. As Paul is leaving the room, Jesus's brother James says, hey man, hang on a minute. Whatever it is you're telling people about my brother, tell them that he cared about the poor. And Paul said that we can agree on. I will tell people that. And they parted, and they never met again. However, a generation later, there was an author who wrote kind of this like swashbuckling hero story called The Acts of the Apostles. That is a biography of Paul. It contains many stories about Paul that Paul himself has never heard of. It contains the story about Paul on the road to Damascus. And in the book, Acts of the Apostles, Paul does go to visit Jesus's brothers and his friend in Jerusalem. And Paul and James get into this big argument that ends with Jesus's brother James falling to his knees and saying, truly you are right about everything, and truly I am wrong, and it is I who needs to learn about Jesus from you. That is nothing at all like what Paul told us. In the Acts of the Apostles, Paul and Jesus's friend Peter get into an argument about what they can eat, and Peter is very stubborn and hard-headed about it, and he says, no, we need to be kosher. And then a couple of days later, Peter comes running up to Paul. He says, man, I have had this vision of a whole great tablecloth of like birds and animals and insects, and I was eating all of them, and I realized we are not kosher anymore. We can eat anything on earth now. You were right, I was wrong. This book, this biography, it's kind of like a historical novel, The Acts of the Apostles. It tells Paul's story in a way that he always wins and he's always right. Paul himself does not tell his own story this way. Paul, when he tells his story, frequently loses arguments and can't get anywhere with people who actually met Jesus. The reason I'm bringing this up now is diversity within early Christianity. Jesus and James and Jude, those people who traveled with Jesus, they never became Christians. They were not Christians. They were Jews who felt that their friend and brother was like the next prophet of Judaism. Not the last prophet, not the greatest prophet, but they felt that he had been like pretty cool and pretty important. They did not think of him as like the cosmic, co-creator of the universe and the savior of all humankind. They just thought he was a good guy. But it is definitely Paul's view of this that wins out in the early church. There was a major division within early Christianity about what is it that Jesus and God really want from us? What is it that they are really paying attention to? And there was a major debate between, is it more important what you believe, or is it more important what you do? Paul's side of the debate was a person is saved not by the works of the Torah, but through faith in Jesus Christ. That if you believe that your actions are not as important. Now, specifically, he's talking about actions like having a kosher diet and getting circumcised and, doing all of that, obeying all of these laws of the Torah. Paul wants us to know that all of that stuff is being renegotiated, that it's not important anymore. But what he says is a person is justified by their faith, not by their works. The New Testament also contains a letter that is attributed to James that argues with this, that says the other side of it. In the letter of James, we read, "What good is it, brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but you do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill,' and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and by my works I will show you my faith.'" This debate, which, when you think about it, this is still probably the primary debate within Christianity today. Is it important, is it more important what you believe, or is it more important what you do? Is it okay to be just a good person, but not do everything you do like trumpeting the name of Jesus? Or is all of that stuff worthless unless you do it in Jesus's name? And that, I hear about that debate all the time. Some people saying it's only important, what you do and say in Jesus's name. And then other people say, well, what if you do the things that he wanted people to do, but you don't say his name all the time? Does God keep track of that? That was a debate, back then. That was a debate at the time. The early church decided strongly in favor of faith, that the only important thing is what you believe, that what you do is secondary. And that is how, if you can imagine, and I can say this as a religious studies teacher who studies a lot of different religions, of all of the religions in the world, Christianity is the only one in which ethics are optional, recommended, but not required. And if doing something ethical should in some way like conflict with like trumpeting the name of Jesus, the ethical thing is right out the window. That is not required. And that is odd to me, that in the biggest religion in the world today, being a good person is recommended but not required. And that's kind of, we kind of see a lot of crummy stuff going on in history because Christians are not required to be good people in order to be saved. It is strongly recommended, but nowhere does that actually become part of being saved. That is a major disagreement. That's a major debate within early Christianity. There was another disagreement, if you can imagine this, about whether or not the Christ had a body, a physical body. As you wandered around in Rome in those first couple of centuries, every so often somebody would like kind of beckon you and say, like, if you give me a couple of denarius, I will tell you the real secret, the secret knowledge of the Christ. And then if you gave them that couple of silver coins, they would say that the real secret is that the Christ was all spirit and had no physical body, and that therefore the crucifixion was an illusion. People thought they saw a body on a cross, but actually it was a spirit. The spirit did not die and was not resurrected. Now that was the secret knowledge, and the Greek word for knowledge is gnosis. And so when we hear about Gnostic Christianity and like the lost gospels, a lot of it is that. A lot of it is based on this kind of this idea that this cosmic spirit took on the illusion of a human body and entered the earth, and that for some reason it was part of the plan that there should be the illusion of a crucifixion and resurrection. A lot of people were out there saying this. I assume most of us today have never heard of this. The reason is when the bishops gathered in Nicaea in the year 325 to decide which gospels would be canonical, they had about 30 gospels to choose from, and a lot of these gospels said that the Christ had no physical body. And the way that they decided that they were going to use these four and not the others, they picked the gospels that contained the most detailed description of the suffering and the torture of the physical body of the Christ. So it's the passion narrative. That's what these four gospels really have in common. And they were selected very intentionally because of the passion narrative, because they wanted to stamp out once and for all this idea that was floating around and that was pretty popular, that the Christ had no physical body. Interestingly enough, a little fun fact, this story in which the Christ had no physical body and the crucifixion was an illusion, the story did not disappear. Interestingly enough, somebody brought that story southward into Arabia, where 600 years later, it appears in the Quran. The Quran tells us that Jesus was not the Son of God, but that he was a prophet of Islam. But in the Quran, he is not resurrected, because in the Quran, God rescues Jesus and sets up this illusion of a body that gets put on a cross. So that idea, which disappeared from Christianity, but believe it or not, is still part of Islam. It still exists there. Although in Islam, the Christ is not pure spirit. He's just this guy, and God makes this illusion of a crucifixion in order to rescue him. Anyway, so this is what you're hearing about when people say, have you read the lost gospels? Have you read the Gnostic gospels, the Gnostic Christianity? And they make it sound very like clandestine and secret and, kind of, whatever. It's really, I've read most of those. They're not that entertaining. And they generally come around to this big secret, which was that the Christ had no physical body. The diversity of early churches included a lot of churches that were led by women speaking in tongues. And Paul mentions this. It is something that Paul in his letter, now we have only everything that we know. I assume that we've all heard of such and such church on the corner where people still speak in tongues like they did in the beginning. Everything that we know about people speaking in tongues comes from a couple of very brief references in the letters of Paul, where he says, you know what, sometimes you show up at a church and people are speaking in tongues and it's just a waste of time and it's boring, but you sit through it and then it's done. He has no interest in it. He does not think that there's anything special about it, but he also does not care about it enough to tell us what it means. He doesn't explain, like, does it mean that these people can suddenly speak in languages that they've never heard before? Does it mean that people are just kind of babbling a lot of nonsense syllables because they're in the grip of the Holy Ghost? Does it mean that people are all of a sudden inspired with like lofty words that you would never think that that person would be able to come up with? There are numerous theories and ideas about what it meant, speaking in tongues in the beginning. And if you're ever feeling really, really, disheartened in life, you can go to YouTube and you can type in people speaking in tongues, and you will see some very, I think, amusing things. Things that you may find will bring a smile to your face. But nobody knows. Nobody knows what this actually is or was. We only know that there were numerous different ideas about how this Christ thing should be done. There were about 30 gospels floating around. Another example of the diversity of early Christianity. There were about 30 gospels floating around. Several of them, we now have like fragments of them that have been translated. Some of them contain really surprising things, like little boy Jesus making a dove out of clay and then bringing it to life and it flies away. Some of them contain really strange things, like in the gospel according to Peter, there is a talking cross, like the cross itself can get up and talk. Some of them contain really disturbing things. There is one gospel that describes, actually in great detail, when somebody conducts an exam on Mary after she gives birth in order to determine whether she could still be a virgin after having a baby. And they say things in it, you say like, oh my goodness, like this was a gospel? Yes, it was. There were a lot of these gospels. And then a lot of them are just a lot of cosmic nonsense. But all these different gospels floating around, there were actually a couple of gospels that had no story at all. No birth, no resurrection, no miracles. They were complete gospels in which it began with this interesting guy said these interesting things, and then he says 30 pages of interesting things, and then it just ends. And it never says, he's important because he rose from the dead. It never tells any miracles. It's just a collection of interesting things said by an interesting guy. So there was actually this great diversity of gospels. The 4 gospels that eventually got chosen when the bishops gathered in Nicaea, most of the bishops could easily agree, as there is one God and one Christ, there should be one gospel. And they had John's gospel all ready to go. But then a certain Bishop Irenaeus got up and he said, whoa, hold on. But as the earth has 4 corners, there should be 4 gospels. And for some reason, nobody took a minute to think about how many corners the earth, how many corners does the earth have? Would you guess? What? Yeah, so by that logic, there should be like 360 gospels if you really want to get all of the corners of the earth. But really, the earth has no corners. But the bishops did. They nodded at this. They said, oh man, that really sounds, whatever. So they did decide to have 4 gospels. They did really think that all of the gospels were written by eyewitnesses. And they said these 4 eyewitness accounts of the passion, the whipping and flailing and crucifixion of Jesus, these 4 agree so well that it must be a fact if we have 4 independent eyewitnesses that agree on all of the details like this. It did not occur to them there was one written document and that 4 authors had all copied it. They had just all plagiarized this same thing. But that's how we got 4 gospels. But even these, and I know I'm putting out a lot of stuff here, so this is, I'll close out on this, but it's really fascinating. The 4 gospels actually have a good deal of diversity just within themselves. In the oldest of the Gospels in the Bible, the theory is that in the year 70, the Jerusalem temple was on fire. It was being torn down and burned by the Roman Empire. And that somebody ran off into a cave with one scroll with a bunch of Jesus's sayings and another scroll with some letters of Paul, went into this place and kind of frantically wrote down this thing, taking some sayings of Jesus and some things that were said by Paul and using it to answer the question, why is the temple on fire? And their answer was, the temple is on fire because there was this guy, Jesus, 40 years ago, and nobody listened to him. And the gospel, according to Mark, is full of temple destruction imagery, like when Jesus says, tear down this temple, and in 3 days, I will rebuild it. He references the destruction of the temple numerous times in that gospel, because that gospel is being written to answer this question, to say the temple's being destroyed because we should all have become Christians back then. Now, we look at the Gospel of Mark and say, wow, Jesus was indeed a true prophet because he was able to imagine the destruction of the temple years later. It's far more likely that it was just some author during the destruction who kind of took that moment and said, this is the time to write this gospel. If you ever got a chance to read the Gospel according to Mark, it will surprise you. It is the shortest of the Gospels. In that gospel, Jesus is primarily an exorcist. He is a demon hunter. And in Mark's gospel, only the demons know who he is. So he goes around and he meets such and such guy who has a demon in him. And while everybody is kind of arguing and confused and trying to figure out who Jesus is, the guy who's possessed by the demon will say, I know who you are. You are the Messiah, the Son of David. You are the Christ. And Jesus will be like, silence demon, and he'll shake the person and slap them around and cast the demon out of them. In Mark's gospel, Jesus, the demon hunter, is violent and he's rude. He is not friendly to anyone. He's not a friendly, compassionate guy. He is a kind of a scary, dark exorcist. And people are kind of afraid of him, and he is unfriendly to them. And the demons understand him. Even when, when Peter says to him, like, hey, man, Jesus is like, dude, we're all going to die. Peter says, like, man, you can survive this. And Peter says, get thee behind me, Satan. It is one of his moments of actually part of his dialogue with these demonic entities that only he can see and that only they can understand him. So I find it to be the most interesting of the Gospels because it's the most unexpected. It's the most strange. Now, it's about half of the length of any of the other Gospels. It is the shortest by far. A generation later, somebody else, whose name we don't know, took the gospel according to Mark, and they also had this other collection of sayings of Jesus, like a father had 2 sons, and, consider the lilies, and, consider the birds. Actually, some of the kind of friendly, interesting sayings of Jesus. And this author, whom we call Matthew, although the gospel was anonymous, took Mark's demon hunter story and kind of softened down the whole demon war thing, and made it more of a healer, like a traveling faith healer story, and added in these 5 long speeches, like the Sermon on the Mount, which does not exist in Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel is always moving too fast for Jesus to just stop and say, everybody sit down, I'm just going to talk for a while. So then you get this, what we call the Gospel of Matthew, It's the same story as Mark, but the demon hunting is played down, the healings are played up, and he stops and gives these long speeches. He's friendlier in Matthew's gospel. At around that same time, another author who doesn't know about Matthew's gospel also takes Mark's gospel, also takes a collection of Jesus' sayings and puts them together. This we call the gospel according to Luke. Now, this author moves a lot of the small town stories into cities. It's a more urban gospel. And in Luke's gospel, Jesus is more concerned about city matters and hierarchy and issues of like social justice. The author of Luke's gospel is writing this gospel, what we call the Gospel of Luke, as part one of a two-part book. The second part is called the Acts of the Apostles. So the author of Luke's gospel does a biography of Jesus and a biography of Paul. And he or she kind of shapes both stories to create a recognition that will kind of recognize certain recurring themes, and that it'll sort of help to establish for us that Jesus and Paul are part of the same story. But it's also this author of the Acts of the Apostles who kind of works in a lot of stuff about Paul that Paul himself had never heard of. About 100 years after the time of Jesus, when everybody who knew him was long gone, this other gospel appears, what we call the Gospel of John. This one is the most different. This author is not holding Mark's gospel and is not holding this collection of Jesus' sayings. The author of John's gospel has got certain things in common with Mark's gospel. This author has the same list of 5 major miracles and adds 2, the wedding of Cana and the resurrection of Lazarus, both of which appear only in this one gospel. This author also has the same passion narrative, the narrative of the torture and crucifixion of Jesus. They have that same document. They don't have the other stuff, and they build a completely different story. There are a lot of stories that appear only in the Gospel of John. And in that gospel, Jesus is more of like a cosmic savior. He is not an exorcist. And his teachings are really only about himself. In that, Jesus speaks in terms of, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I am the sheep gate, I am the shepherd, I am the true vine. He doesn't tell quirky stories about fathers and sons. He just gives these long poetic speeches with lists of things that I am, according to him. So what we're looking at today, you can walk into any church in the world and they will tell you, in the beginning, all of the early Christians agreed. Then there was disagreement, but there will be agreement again. What I'm telling you today is that there never has been that wide agreement within Christianity. Even the Bible itself is full of kind of, diversity of thought and idea about who and what Jesus is and what he wants. Good. So this concludes our this part of the series, but we'll probably pick back up in September. Good. So thank you.